Hello and welcome. Today we're going to give you 7 reasons to fall in love with Saint Thomas Aquinas. I know not everyone is a huge fan of Thomas Aquinas, and maybe you signed up for the Institute because you're interested in one of the other topics, maybe St. Augustine or Old New Testament, Mariology, something like that. But today I want to encourage and challenge you to fall in love with Thomas, and we're going to go through 7 reasons why I love him. And the first is Thomas Aquinas is very easy to understand. When I was a sophomore in college, I was taking a lot of philosophy courses, and I took a course on medieval philosophy. And we were reading through, Islamic philosophers from the Middle Ages. We were looking at Jewish philosophers. And when we came to Thomas Aquinas, he just resonated with me. It was so clear and concise and honestly beautiful. And it was one of those moments, like where you meet your spouse for the first time, or you get that job that just is a perfect fit and you realize this is what I was meant to do. It was like one of those moments. I just fell in love with him because he lays out things so systematically. So the first reason is he's easy to understand. The second is Thomas Aquinas is a realist. A lot of people are afraid of philosophy because philosophers, they talk about a lot of highfalutin things. And Thomas does that as well. But Thomas, as a student of Albert the Great, and for a way of background, Albert the Great was the great medieval mind, and he was an expert in, zoology and botany and cosmology, and basically the original Renaissance man. Thomas sat under him and learned what he knew from Albert the Great. And Thomas inherits that appreciation for the created world, this world. So Thomas's philosophy, of course, relates to the supernatural, but also to the natural. And I think it's especially accessible because he does appreciate the world in which we live and we move every day. Now, the third reason that you should fall in love with Thomas Aquinas, and one of the reasons I love him, is that Thomas Aquinas is a mystic. And a lot of people miss this about Thomas. They think of him as like a book smart guy or a guy who's always camped out in the library, and that's not the case. The most famous story happened in 1273, December 6th. And after Matins, some of the friars saw St. Thomas off to the side, and he had a mystical experience. And some of the friars say he was actually levitating off the floor, floating in the air, in which Christ said to him, "Thomas, you have written well of me. You have written well of me." And Thomas at that time had just finished his section on the Eucharist and the Summa. And then later, when his secretary asked him to continue dictating his great magnum opus, the Summa Theologiae, Thomas wouldn't do it. And Reginald asked why. And he said, "Reginald, I can no longer write. Everything I've written seems as straw compared to what I've seen." So whatever vision Thomas had, he realized that his writing career was over. Something mystical had happened to Thomas that day. And because of that, the great magnum opus, which we're going to be studying in the Institute all the time, is unfinished. It stops at that point in his life. No more writing. So that's the third reason. The fourth reason is Thomas Aquinas is extremely Eucharistic. So if you have a great love for the Blessed Sacrament, for the Holy Eucharist, Thomas Aquinas is your guy. Not only did Thomas write the hymns and the prayers for Corpus Christi, but also for benediction of the Blessed Sacrament. And there's also a really beautiful legend or story about Thomas Aquinas, an anecdote, that when he was puzzling over a biblical or philosophical question, and Thomas couldn't find the answer, he would go into the church by himself, he'd go up to the altar, and he would place his head on the tabernacle, and he would whisper and talk to Jesus and pray that he would get those answers directly from Christ, which is really amazing when you think about that he had that kind of intimacy, and that his scholastic work, his academic work, was so integrated into his love for God. The fifth reason to fall in love with Thomas is that he is a great saint for purity and chastity, which is a big issue in our own age. And Thomas Aquinas, not only was he a scholar and a mystic, but he was a man of great moral purity. And the story you probably know, but I'll recount it just in case, is when he was a young man, he wanted to become a Dominican friar. And his parents resisted that. So they were wealthy, and they locked him up into the family tower. And one of his brothers, we don't know all the details, brought a harlot, a prostitute, into his chamber to try to tempt him and break his resolve from being a Dominican. Well, when the woman, the harlot, was introduced into the room, Thomas ran over to the fireplace and he picked up a burning log and he chased the woman out of the room. That's not the end of the story. So once the door was closed, he took this smoldering log, this piece of wood, and with the charred end, he made a cross on the wall. And then he fell down on his knees and he began to pray. And the tradition is at that moment, 2 angels appeared at his side, and they girded him, or they wrapped a cord around his loins as a symbol of his purity and dedication and devotion to God. And it is said from that moment, for the rest of his life, he never had an impure temptation or sexual thought or any lustful idea. He was completely given over to God in that way. A very beautiful story. Now, the 6th reason to fall in love with Thomas Aquinas is that Thomas is extremely Christ-centered in his theology. Not all philosophers are like this, right? But Thomas, as a medieval man, of course, has this great devotion as a Catholic and as a Dominican. And his Summa Theologiae, all of his works, have this sort of climax towards Christ, this crescendo towards Christ. You see this in the Summa Theologiae. He begins with God and the Trinity and the angels and creation and human destiny and the virtues. But then in the 3rd part, he gets right there to the incarnation of Christ, and he analyzes the person, work, and ministry of Christ. And for this reason, Thomas is very helpful in speaking with non-Catholics, Protestant friends, and even non-Christians, because he gives a very distilled and beautiful account of what it means to be a Christian. And the 7th reason to fall in love with Thomas Aquinas is that Thomas has been endorsed more by the popes in the church than any other saint when it comes to academic excellence and learning. Thomas Aquinas has been approved over and over and over by the popes that this is the guy to go to if you want to get straight on your philosophy and your theology. In fact, canon law in the Catholic Church requires all seminarians training for the priesthood to study Saint Thomas Aquinas. And I also want to share with you a quote from Pope Leo XIII, and it's from his encyclical Aeterni Patris in 1879. And listen carefully to what he says here about St. Thomas. Pope Leo says, "We exhort you, venerable brethren, in all earnestness, to restore the golden wisdom of St. Thomas, and to spread it far and wide for the defense and beauty of the Catholic faith, for the good of society, and for the advantage of all the sciences. Let carefully selected teachers endeavor to implant the doctrine of Thomas Aquinas in the minds of students and set forth clearly his solidity and excellence over others." End quote. Pope Leo XIII, 1879, Aeterni Patris. So we see here that Thomas Aquinas is prescribed not only for the defense and beauty of the Catholic Church, but for the good of society. Well, I hope these 7 reasons to fall in love with Thomas Aquinas have piqued your interest, and I'd like to encourage you to go a little deeper. If you've never read the Summa, we have a screencast called How to Read the Summa, and it's a 10 to 15 minute tutorial. I'll show you the structure of St. Thomas Aquinas' magnum opus, the Summa, and I'll also show you how to read an article so that you won't get confused. It's very clear, very concise, not intimidating. So go over there and check it out. It's called How to Read the Summa, and I think you'll be very excited to get started on this. So thank you for watching 7 reasons to fall in love with Thomas Aquinas, and we'll see you in the next video. Thank you, and God bless.